Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here to the William G. McGowan Theater at the National Archives. Whether you're here in person or joining us on YouTube, we're glad you could join us for today's discussion of the new book, The Road to Camelot, Inside JFK's 5-Year Campaign by Thomas Oliphant and Curtis Wilkie. Before I get started, I want to tell you about two other programs coming up here in the McGowan Theater. On Tuesday, August 22nd at noon, award-winning author Walter Starr will be here to talk about his new book, Stanton, Lincoln's War Secretary. Starr offers a masterly account of one of the great characters of the Civil War. The Secretary of War from 1862 to 1865 was irascible, autocratic, and vengeful, but also steadfast, punctilious, and practical. This fascinating biography reveals how such a complex and unlikely figure came to play such a vital role at the country's hour of peril. On Thursday, September 7th at 7, please join us for the program The Words That Built America, narrated by Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David McCullough. The Words That Built America is an unabridged reading of the authentic words of our founding fathers. Joining us to introduce the film will be director-producer Alexander Pelosi, who brought together more than 100 readers, including all the living presidents and vice presidents, as well as Supreme Court justices, cabinet secretaries, and the leaders of the Senate and House of Representatives, including her mother, along with a wide variety of celebrities, leading media figures, and young people to read these iconic documents. To learn more about these and all of our public programs, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby, as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by regular mail and email. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby also. Thomas Oliphant and Curtis Wilkie take us behind the scenes of John F. Kennedy's campaign to the White House and the road to Camelot. The authors follow Kennedy from his failed attempt to win the vice presidential nomination in 1956 to his success at capturing the presidency in 1960. The book offers a detailed account of how a young Kennedy plots his way to the presidency and changes the way we nominate and elect presidents. In reviewing Road to Camelot, Harvard historian Frederick Lagervall writes in the Boston Globe, perhaps the best thing about the Road to Camelot is the author's unmistakable and quite infectious love for their subject, their palpable affection for that many-splendored thing called the American presidential campaign. And Steve Donahue of the Christian Science Monitor says, veteran reporters Thomas Oliphant and Curtis Wilkie have crafted a tougher and more balanced account of the long campaign than anybody's written yet. The authors pull no punches in their assessment of the candidate whose story they're telling. This is the story of John Kennedy making all the decisions and calling all the shots, a man in complete control of his message and his campaign, the chief architect of his own victory. Oliphant and Wilkie did considerable research at the Kennedy Library in Boston, which has proved to be a magnificent resource for them. The Kennedy Library and 13 other presidential libraries are part of the National Archives and are tremendous resources for the study of the presidency and those who have occupied the office since Herbert Hoover in 1929. Thomas Oliphant is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author. After graduation from Harvard, he joined the staff of the Boston Globe. During his nearly 4-decade career with the newspaper, he served as its Washington correspondent and reported on 10 presidential campaigns. He was one of the editors who managed the Boston Globe's coverage of school desegregation in Boston, work which won the 1975 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. He's also received a writing award from the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Oliphant has been a frequent guest on television news programs, including Nightline, Face the Nation, and the Today Show, Good Morning America, CBS This Morning, and the News Hour with Jim Lehrer on PBS. He's also a regular guest on the Al Franken Show, where he also appeared as a guest host. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Thomas Oliphant.
Thank you, David. You know, he didn't identify himself adequately. He's what we call up in Massachusetts a townie from Beverly to the north of the city, which means he grew up in the shadow of Richard Nixon's running mate, Henry Cabot Lodge, and survived the experience as near as I can tell. The way I'm going to do this, since our drivel was published in May, I've noticed it's very important to keep remarks to the point and sort of short, because given the subject matter, John Kennedy, everybody seems to have questions, comments, and whatever. So if you'd be kind enough to give me about 40 minutes to babble, I'll leave plenty of time so you can yell at me. David, I would imagine, is maybe a little tired of all the encomiums and words of praise that writers like me, excuse me, heap on the National Archives, which some of us like to call the Fort Knox of American history. It's all true. It is an amazing place and an amazing resource, but I wish sometimes somebody would give the other side. Because of what they do, people like me get to sit in rooms in buildings all over the country for months on end. They bring you big cartons of files. You can't go get them yourself. You have to ask specifically for stuff. They bring it to you, usually on a cart, and you sit there and you take a piece of paper out and look at it and put it over here. And this right to left drudgery goes on for weeks at a time sometimes before you find something. I remember the first week, the most interesting thing I found about the Kennedy campaign was a 1958 memo announcing with great enthusiasm that there would be cookies and coffee in the conference room for the scheduling staff at 3 o'clock. And then every once in a while, a little gem falls out. And I vividly remember my first one. I was looking through a folder about the early organizational structure of the Kennedy campaign. This one dated from from 59, and for some reason out pops a piece of paper. And it was written by Ted Sorensen, whom President Kennedy liked to call his intellectual blood bank. It was on one sheet of paper a couple of weeks before the Democratic convention in Los Angeles that nominated his boss for president. And on the sheet of paper were Sorensen's recommendations for a running mate. The senior staff, the most senior staff, about 5 people, had Kennedy's permission to submit one of these memos. And I was looking at Sorensen's. And the name at the top of his list was Lyndon Johnson. That's not why Kennedy chose him. We discovered an awful lot about that consequential selection. But it was interesting to actually see something. And it was the first experience I had at that library where you could feel like you were almost there. None of the other senior staff recommended Johnson, by the way. The story is weird and convoluted, and I'll try to get to some of it, and maybe a question or two will bring it out of me further. But I'm talking about the experience of the archives, which can be mind-numbing drudgery on the one hand and thrilling discovery on the other. You also learn along the way what a changing topic history is. It's not a fixed star in the sky. I mean, it's still true that Columbus made his voyage in 1492, but just look in the last several years how views of his voyage, its impact on people and on the world have changed. And when the subject is John Kennedy, it's equally dynamic, not static. One of the discoveries that Curtis and I made during our couple of years getting eye strain at various facilities of David's around the country is that Kennedy, in some ways, for the last 54 years since he was murdered, has been too easy. Publishers have been happy to print theories, speculation, gossip. The evidentiary standards for the work are surprisingly low, and the durability of the so-called information in much of the work is minimal. And we came to the conclusion very early that it was time maybe to see if a fresh look was in order. And it didn't take much longer to realize that the time really had come to take another peek at this highly improbable event, the ascension and then the election of Kennedy. You know, his daughter likes to say in recent years that her father's time in the public square is slowly but surely becoming part of history. And it's an important transition because that's where places like the National Archives come in. And it is to be hoped, at least by some of us, that the standards for research and writing about President Kennedy are about to go up. I don't know how much lower they can get. But it's to be hoped that the standards are going to go up quite a bit. And we were encouraged that people who want to do the work, and there's a Mount Everest-sized pile of stuff to go through, people who want to do the work are going to be rewarded with things like that Sorensen memo on the running mate selection. I just wanted to give you a few examples of what you bump into if you take up the challenge of actually doing research. For one thing, you discover or rediscover people who were in danger of being lost to history, but who played extremely important roles in the rise of John Kennedy and in his election. And one of my favorite examples is a foreign policy expert and professor named Fred Holborn, who died a few years ago after a brilliant career at Johns Hopkins, where he was very important in the formation and development of their school that studies foreign policy so famously well. But in the early 1950s, Fred Holborn was a young teaching assistant at Harvard. He was the son of basically refugees who had gotten out of Nazi Germany, luckily early, right after Hitler came to power. And by the early 1950s, he was a teaching assistant in a government survey course at Harvard that was taught by a foreign policy professional by the name of McGeorge Bundy, who would become the dean at Harvard and eventually President Kennedy's national security advisor after doing a little work on the side for a new organization called the Central Intelligence Agency. But Professor Holborn was just a teaching assistant in Bundy's class. And in his section, there was a young Harvard undergraduate named Edward Kennedy. And these two people sort of hit it off. And a few years later, when Edward Kennedy was traveling in northern Africa, they happened to collide. And much of the trip, that Edward Kennedy made in Algeria was made in Fred Holborn's company. And when they got back to the United States, he wanted very much to introduce Professor Holborn to his brother, then a senator from Massachusetts. And out of that association came, among other things, the most important foreign policy initiative of Senator John Kennedy when he had just begun running for president in 1957, the speech in which he broke with standard American doctrine and opposed the existing policy of support for the French colonial regime in Algeria and in effect supported independence. That's not all he did. It turns out from oral histories and documents in his files that are now available, you can trace the evolution of somebody who became John Kennedy's foreign policy, not guru, but clearinghouse. He assembled materials for Kennedy. He helped him as a staff member in the Senate develop his positions on a host of issues all the way through the campaign in 1960 and all the way into the White House and national security staff. Fred Holborn should not be forgotten, and his existence in the files that the National Archives has at the Kennedy Library in Boston is a very good example of the blanks that remain to be filled in about this remarkable story. So, too, does somebody whom Fred Holborn introduced John Kennedy to in his capacity as sort of clearinghouse for foreign policy work in the Senate office and then in the presidential campaign. You know him, sadly, as one of the architects of the Americanization of the war in Vietnam, Walt Whitman Rostow. But at the time, Walt Rostow was one of the country's leading intellectuals who combined expertise in foreign policy with expertise in economics. And the Eisenhower administration consulted with him on several issues, and he and Kennedy began to talk, and they hit it off. Professor Rostow at the time was working on what became a very important, if short, book in economics called The Stages of Economic Growth. And in it, he wrestled with this question of how do societies develop, and then once they've developed, how do they remain vibrant? How do they look for things to do that will keep their circulation going and avoid the fate of so many civilizations, namely decline? And he had a view of America in the mid-1950s, a country he thought was stagnating a little bit and needed new blood, new leadership, and new policies. And Kennedy later told a friend that in his work with Walt Rostow, he developed the phrase that formed the basic architecture of the stump speech he used from the instant he began the formal campaign in 1960 all the way through to the election. Let's get this country moving again. And it came basically out of the head of an MIT professor who sadly is known as one of Lyndon Johnson's key people in Vietnam policy, but who also played a huge role in the development of the intellectual side of John Kennedy's campaign. A third one. Everybody who reads a little bit about Kennedy hears the name Larry O'Brien. Second generation Irish American from Springfield, Mass. His dad ran a part saloon, part restaurant in Springfield, dabbled in local politics. Larry O'Brien had a law degree, was the fulcrum for John Kennedy's run for the Senate in 1952, defeating David's neighbor, Henry Cabot Lodge, in the process. And then went on not only to serve as the organizational director of John Kennedy's presidential campaign, but then to move on under Lyndon Johnson. He was actually the head of the Democratic National Committee and the target of the Watergate break-in. And then, of course, later in life was the commissioner of the NBA, and the championship trophy is named after him. But Larry O'Brien was in charge of the organization that elected John Kennedy first senator and then president. And about 9 months into our research, one of these geniuses who works up there as an archivist came over to me and said, "You know, Larry O'Brien's papers are going to become available next week." And that interested, there are delays sometimes, families, conditions. It's a complicated process. I leave it to others to explain. I don't understand it. But at any rate, all of a sudden, here were about 6 or 7 carts full of files. And Curtis and I took a peek and stopped our research dead in its tracks, and we didn't do a damn thing for another month until we had absorbed every word of these, as it turned out, very important files. Larry O'Brien was a street-oriented politician, but at the same time, he had that son of immigrants concern about rectitude, and he was a meticulous record keeper. And thanks to him, the records of the presidential campaign, both in the primaries and in the general election, are greatly enhanced. Let me just give you one example about the debates. There are folders and folders about what went into Kennedy's preparation, what happened during the debates, but I wanted to just cite one thing that we just happened upon in one of the folders. Every morning after each of the 4 debates with Nixon, Lou Harris, Kennedy's pollster and the first guy to ever do that full-time on a presidential campaign, every morning after each of the 4, Lou Harris would send his army of poll takers out into the field around the country. And by nightfall, they would have 700 to 800 cases. And Mr. Harris would then stay up all night, putting the numbers together, writing a report, and submitting it the next morning to only Larry O'Brien, Ken O'Donnell, the political advisor, Bob Kennedy, the campaign manager, and John Kennedy. And each of these surveys was in the files and had never been examined before. And they tell us something fascinating that forced us to change our view of the debates. The standard myth is that Nixon looked like he'd been sleeping on the street for a week before the first debate. Kennedy looked like he'd been in Palm Beach for a month before the first debate. He was forceful, Nixon was kind of weird, and Kennedy clobbered him. Well, that's not entirely true, as Lou Harris found. What he discovered was that the public's reaction to the debate was indeed that Kennedy had way outperformed Nixon. The word Lou Harris used in the poll was who was more effective, and it was Kennedy by 10, 15 percentage points. Huge for something like that. But the horse race didn't change at all. And it didn't change after the second debate, and not after the third debate, and not when the debates were all over. The work that Larry O'Brien meticulously saved, thank God, shows that for all the hoopla about the debates. They ended up merely confirming the reality at the time, which was this was an extremely close election, continuity versus change. We described it, it's sort of like two people on a teeter-totter, only this one will only move about 2 inches in one direction and then 2 inches in the other direction. And the real important fact is the balanced nature of it. And so Harris's analysis, and it certainly makes sense in terms of the final result, was that, yeah, Nixon looked awful in the first one, not in the subsequent ones. He was behaving like a high school debater, whereas Kennedy was communicating with television. But Kennedy wasn't changing the race. He was building up his own image, if you will. He appeared to be a plausible president, but he did not convincingly defeat Nixon in those debates, and it is wrong to see them as pivotal. Thank you, Larry O'Brien, for saving everything. In just the Kennedy Library in Boston, someone told me early on, there are 25 million pieces of paper, including announcements about cookies and coffee in the conference room. But it's a massive amount of material for such a short life. But what we discovered is that in large part, no one had ever gone all the way through the parts of this treasure trove that concerned his earlier years and his campaigns. And by being willing to do so, we discovered a whole bunch of stuff that changed our perceptions of how this improbable event happened. In the standard telling, like our mentor, Teddy White's Making of the President, 1960, this is a 12, 18-month process, told in narrative, dramatic form that changed politics and changed journalism, to be sure. But we didn't find a 12 to 18-month campaign. We found a 5-year campaign, conscious effort to get national office. We dated the beginning, we might get a little argument about this, but we dated the beginning to some material we found in the late summer of 1955 after two of the most famous heart attacks in American political history. Initially, Lyndon Johnson's out in Middleburg, where he was spending the weekend in the midsummer of 1955. And 10 weeks later, President Eisenhower himself visiting his in-laws near Denver. In the chaos that followed these, what we called this cardiac doubleheader, John Kennedy's father, about whom more in a second, concocted this really ridiculous idea. But in his mind, the fact that an idea was ridiculous never prevented him from trying to advance it. And the idea, and he even enlisted a lobbyist to make the case to Johnson himself, was that Johnson was in his 40s, people saw him as healthy, and he was okay, blah, blah, blah. But the pitch he made to Johnson was that Johnson should run for president in 1956 against a possibly crippled President Eisenhower. Joe Kennedy would bankroll the whole thing, and of course John Kennedy would be the running mate. The evidence is that Johnson considered this for about 20 seconds before laughing it off, but the exercise had an impact on Kennedy. It awakened a curiosity about the national scene. And from the moment that started in the late summer of 1955 until the night he was elected president, the day he was elected president in November of 1960, it was a steady progression of activity. He never moved backwards. He never made a decision that turned this off or stopped it. But initially for the vice presidency, and then by the summer of 1956, with the presidency in his mind, it just never stopped. And the evidence of his activity is voluminous. If the 21st century rules applied in 1956, hacks like me would have written that John Kennedy has begun to run for national office, and by the summer of 1956, when the Democratic Convention was held and he got a lucky burst of enormously favorable attention, that the guy's going to run for president 4 years, and we would have tracked his movements but nobody did that back then. People who were interested in national office could operate in the shadows a little bit while they got their sea legs, which is what Kennedy did. But there was no question from the evidence that this all started in the late summer of 1955. The first mention of him that we could find came, for those of you who are of a certain age and remember Newsweek magazine and when it was a little bit bigger and more prosperous than it is today, had a political gossip column at the front of the magazine every week called The Periscope. And in September of 1955, there was an item that, people who might be Adlai Stevenson's running mate if he goes again for president in 1956 are being talked about in Washington. And those mentioned include, and there were a few names, Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, and John Kennedy. And it intrigued the hell out of Kennedy, who called the editor of the Periscope section, a journalist many of us knew later in life named Debs Meyer, and said, "Debs, who's doing the mentioning?" To which Debs replied, "Me." Introducing Kennedy to the somewhat incestuous relationship that existed then and to a certain extent still does between political reporters and politicians. But if that got him thinking and beginning to maneuver, it never stopped. The research we did also convinced us that from the beginning, and actually from the beginning of John Kennedy's political career in 1946, he routinely, almost instinctively, rejected every piece of advice and order or whatever that came from his father. Not because he didn't love him. That is a fierce clan, still is. But in politics, Joe Kennedy was already damaged goods by the end of World War II. And Kennedy and his two younger brothers, as well as his sisters, routinely ignored or rejected their father's constant, loud advice. And it happened, as I say, right at the beginning with this foolish idea about 1956, and it continued on and on and on all the way through. The idea that John Kennedy's father was anything remotely resembling some, guy manipulating puppet strings or orchestrating his son's nomination or election, or even that the money was all that important. Just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And it's a shame that this interesting relationship hasn't gotten more detailed examination over the years. As I indicated a second ago, research will show a very different story than traditionally told about how John Kennedy came to select Lyndon Johnson as his running mate. We found an almost entirely neglected oral history left by Bob Kennedy that on the morning after John Kennedy was nominated in Los Angeles, and it became a live topic, Bob Kennedy said they kicked it around for a couple of hours, decided they did not want him. The issue was trust. But John Kennedy had a caveat. According to his brother, because of Johnson's position and because the subject had already been broached, Bob Kennedy, everybody needed to find something for Lyndon Johnson to do in 1960 that would make him happy, keep him happy, and indeed, more than happy, involved and helpful. And as Bob Kennedy put it in the oral history, we tried, and we just couldn't come up with anything. And that's how Johnson came to be chosen. Research will also show you that this is the first modern presidential campaign. It began to dawn on us very early that in poring over all this stuff, and God, it's in California, it's in Texas, it's in New York, certainly it's in Boston, that we were watching modern politics being invented on the fly by a small, tight band of rookies. And nothing symbolizes it better than a check we found, a personal check from John Kennedy, written in December of 1957 to a young pollster named Lou Harris. Nobody in Harris's racket had ever been a staff member of a presidential campaign to that point. Mr. Harris, I should add, died just a year ago, in his 90s, but still sharp as a tack until the end, and quite conscious of his role as a kind of trailblazer for better and for worse in this aspect of presidential campaigning. But Lou Harris, we discovered, was in the field for John Kennedy as early as the late winter of 1957-58. He took his first poll in Wisconsin, the pivotal first primary state in 1960, in the spring of 1958. In 1959, his trial heat came up with the same 10-point margin that Kennedy actually won by a year later. What made the victory seem like a defeat we can get to later, but the point is that Kennedy's campaign was greatly aided by this new form, relatively new form of research, both in trying to figure out how to run and where. At that time, looking ahead to 1960, there were going to be 16 primaries. It was axiomatic in Kennedy's head from the very beginning that there was only one choice. You're dead or you win them all of them, no exceptions. But even if you did that, you were maybe a third of the way to the nomination. And Lou Harris's work turns out to have been, I never realized this, instrumental in not manipulating, but maneuvering politicians around the country into support of him in places where there weren't primaries, or maybe where by avoiding a primary against, say, a favorite son, governor or senator, Kennedy had a shot at all the delegates in a particular state. And the classic example of this that really was Kennedy's first substantial victory was Ohio. But Mr. Harris's work was the background for the critical decisions that this bunch of young people around Kennedy made that determined where he would campaign and how. And the work they did in the states that did not have primaries turned out to have been every bit as crucial as what they did in the states that did. The so-called bosses turned out to be lagging indicators, not leading indicators. And in almost every case, they were late footnotes to what already was considerable Kennedy success in their states. The archives, all this material that, as I like to say, is hiding in plain sight. On the one hand, as I said, there are so many rewards to come from doing the drudgery. But it's interesting to me how many things come out of the blue, like that Sorensen memo I alluded to in the beginning. For example, I was in the, what do they call it, audio-visual department of the Kennedy Library one afternoon looking for pictures, and there are zillions of them. And the genius in charge of the department happened to casually ask me, have you looked at any of the commercials for the West Virginia primary? Well, I didn't know there had been commercials in the West Virginia primary. I was dimly aware of Kennedy's affinity for television, but it never occurred to me. And she happened to have videotapes of 5 or 6 of them. And I watched them and realized, of course, instantly that for better and for worse, John Kennedy turns out to have been the father of the 30-second television commercial. At the time, TV ads were an afterthought. Statewide campaigns, national ones, sometimes they would have these grand programs at the end of campaigns lasting 3 or 4 hours. They'd buy a network and have like a variety show that just went on and on and on and on. And as the 50s went on, this process evolved a bit to where candidates were buying 5-minute chunks of time at the end of shows and putting on snippets of their speeches. The networks hated this because obviously it interfered with the end of their regularly scheduled programs, made the viewers angry. And this woman at the Kennedy Library said she had heard somewhere that Kennedy's sister had been instrumental in the development of this art form for her brother's use. And as it turned out, the very next day, I happened to be scheduled to spend a day with Ambassador Jean Kennedy Smith on Sutton Place in New York. And if you ever get a chance, you should go spend a day with her, if you could. She's, of course, well into her 80s, but still sharp as a tack. Every bit the politician her brother was, and of course an accomplished diplomat as our ambassador to Ireland when the peace process in Northern Ireland really got going. And sure, in the 1940s and 50s, as a young person, she was an actor. I didn't know this. And she worked, including a lot of stuff for television, family dramas, they called them then. And the producer she worked with a lot of the time was a guy named Jack Devine. And she thought very highly of him and had suggested that, to her brother, that he get to know this guy because he seemed to really know television. So Kennedy did. And the result was a commercial television producer named Jack Devine produced these 30-second ads for Kennedy that began to air during the pivotal West Virginia primary. And they really, they turned out to have spent a lot of money putting these ads on the air. In those days, you could do a minute in prime time in West Virginia for $100. The ad, by today's standards, the ads are on the raw side. But on the one hand, a couple of them begin with, here's Senator Kennedy in his own words, and there'd be an excerpt from a speech. But they also used him to send messages. One of the reasons we discovered that Kennedy won in such a landslide in West Virginia was that he was seen as running not against Hubert Humphrey, but against the whole institutional Democratic Party that was trying to block his nomination. And so the ad sent a message of David versus Goliath, which of course is perfect fodder for primary campaign. There was another one by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's son on religion, which Kennedy chose to confront rather than avoid in the campaign. Lou Harris's work on this subject is just, we found, riveting. His argument was, and he would provide the numbers to prove it, was that Kennedy's Catholicism was as much a benefit as a handicap, and that the important thing was talking about it, not ignoring it. And the general perception had been that back in 1928, one of the big mistakes Governor Al Smith of New York made was that he rarely talked about his religion. Kennedy is the exact opposite. Repeatedly, beginning in 1956 even. And by the time of probably one of the more famous video recorded events of the campaign happened, the appearance before a group of Protestant ministers in Houston, there wasn't a syllable in that appearance that Kennedy hadn't been saying for 4 years, to usually good effect. Two-edged sword, not just simply a handicap. And this kind of research prepared us for the end game, where we developed when you have an election this close, and it doesn't get any closer than this one, with very few exceptions in American history, but when you have an election this close, there's almost anything you can cite as covering the margin, right? We thought the more important thing to do was to look for things that happened at the end that were new and that appeared to move voters. And we found 3 things in the research. One, on the Republican side, President Eisenhower woke up and started working hard for Richard Nixon. After a couple of celebrated insults Nixon's way earlier in the year. And the impact of Eisenhower on the road was substantial and measurable, we discovered. Secondly, religion came back into the campaign in the final days in a negative way. There was an episode in Puerto Rico that got a lot of coverage in the American press, where the bishops, Catholic bishops in Puerto Rico, went all out to defeat one of the candidates that year for governor, including warning parishioners that excommunication awaited those who supported the wrong candidate, which of course fed right into the silly bigotry that Kennedy confronted because of his religion. And there was a considerable amount of damage control on the Kennedy side in the final days. But the fact remains that the issue popped up again. It was on the radar, and we knew from our earlier research that it in fact moved voters. The second one is often referred to in myth as the phone call John Kennedy made to Martin Luther King's wife while he was in a very dangerous Georgia prison at the very end of the campaign, after having been in a sit-in and then bagged for some earlier silly violation, mistreated horribly, and sent to the state prison in an awful town called Reedsville. That's not what happened. There were actually 2 things that occurred simultaneously. John and Robert Kennedy each had a long way to go to get religion on civil rights, but they were on their journey when all this happened. Kennedy expressed his concern, but so did Bob Kennedy, independently and more privately. And in fact, it was Bob Kennedy's call to the judge who was responsible for Dr. King being in the jail that got him sprung, coincidentally, not very many days before the election. The impact was electric and immediate. The most important black politician in Georgia was not Martin Luther King, it was his father. And while the son felt he could not get involved in partisan politics openly, Daddy King, as he was known, switched his allegiance on the spot from Nixon to Kennedy. And then the people in the Kennedy campaign including a marvelously courageous man who's still with us, Harris Wofford, with a couple of his friends, came up with the idea, independent of both John and Robert Kennedy, who didn't know anything about it, of doing their best to publicize what had happened without triggering the so-called white backlash. And what they did was they had printed a little pamphlet on two sides of one piece of paper. One side, Kennedy gets King out of jail. The other side, Nixon does nothing, consciously did nothing. They were called in the campaign the blue bombs because they were printed on blue paper. There's still an argument about how many of these things were printed. We're positive at least 1 million, possibly 2 million. But in African American churches all over America on the final weekend, these things were handed out. And you can see it in the turnout. There was a spike in African American turnout in at least 20 major cities in the country. In the North, Midwest, probably enough to basically give Kennedy the states he won in the Midwest. Certainly on the East Coast, New Jersey and New York. President Eisenhower always said it was the King incident that elected Kennedy. And we think he was right. Just please never forget how close it was and how all of our attraction to his thinking, his ideas, and the way he campaigned shouldn't blot out the fact that he just barely fell over the finish line. I think the popular vote margin is well known, not quite 120,000 votes. The Electoral College victory looks more substantial, kind of like Trump's last year, 306 or so, 310. But it's very misleading. If you look at the numbers, there were 20 states out of 50. That was the first election where Alaska and Hawaii were part of the equation. But there were 20 of the 50 states where the margin was 5 percentage points or less. And Kennedy won 13 of them. And in those 13, only in North Carolina, and just by a smidgen, did the margin reach 4 percentage points. And in 5 of the states, enough to cover his Electoral College margin, he won by less than 1 percentage point. So, as Caroline Kennedy likes to say, all of this is slowly but surely slipping into history. But our contention is that it's a history that needs a lot more study. And as far as we are concerned, we have barely skimmed the surface of it. So with that, you can yell at me or ask me something or... There are microphones on the side. Yes, sir.
Folks, we only have a little time left, so please keep your remarks to your questions only.
Yeah, so one of those states was Illinois, where I was living, and my father was a Democratic precinct captain working for Jack Kennedy and the Democratic organization.
Which ward?
Which ward? He was in the 29th ward, Bernie Neinstein, Senator Bernie Neinstein's ward.
So white ethnic.
Actually, it was changing at that time. Actually, it was a changing, maybe 60% to black, whatever. And I still remember that torchlight parade that Mayor Daley put on, like with days to go, which I think really made a difference. I think the margin was 37,000 votes, something like that. 9,000. Okay. Thanks for the correction.
I'm condemned to know the answers to things like that.
So my question for you is, now here both are Irish Catholics, Dick Daley and then Senator Kennedy, but different types of, both Irish Catholic, but from different sides of the track, so to speak, blue collar, and then, Hyannisport and so on. How did they manage this relationship? And was Sergeant Shriver the one? Because I know the
No.
Kennedys owned the. Okay.
Yeah, good question. Because Daley's such a very good example of how Kennedy did this thing. There wasn't a natural affinity, except on one thing. Mayor Daley did not aspire to be President of the United States, you may have heard. And to him, candidates who could pull in his ticket in the city and in Cook County were what counted. And his judgment from the very beginning, and he told Kennedy this in 1959, we have a record of it, was that he'd support him for that reason. But he had to win the early primaries. And if he did that, Daley said, Cook County and Chicago will be there for you. He had a separate set of alliances, largely with one of the leading liberals of the time, Senator Paul Douglas, that dealt with Southern Illinois. But this was business. And Mayor Daley wanted a candidate, and after living through the 52 and 56 debacles in Illinois, is he wanted those offices back in Democratic hands. The big one was state's attorney in Cook County, which was Republican in 1960 until the election. And the election of a Democrat was almost as narrow as Kennedy's victory in the state. But this was classic Daley. And Kennedy knew, the one thing that I think is special about Kennedy is he knew what Daley was and what he wasn't. That he was Cook County and he was Chicago, but he wasn't necessarily the state. To win Illinois, you have to be a politician with a broader appeal. And that makes his alliance with Paul Douglas. And we went into great detail about how this happened. Paul Douglas, for example, turned out to be the key reason Ted Sorensen went to work for Kennedy in 1953. This was a real relationship. And to win the state as narrowly as Kennedy did, having Paul Douglas in his corner was every bit as important as Mayor Daley. Yes?
Throughout the research, what did you find most interesting? What did you find most interesting about learning about the Bailey Report? And was there anything about the Bailey Report that you found particularly new or surprising?
There's a great line attached to it. For those of you who didn't follow that, the Bailey Report is the first early example of just how interested in national office John Kennedy was. And as 1956 began, nobody had to tell him that religion would have to be a factor. And he needed to counter the impression, very widespread, that since 1928, you just couldn't do it if you were Catholic. National office was out of bounds. And so he had Ted Sorensen get to work on a document of political analysis. It's sometimes dismissed by historians. We didn't. We thought it was both prescient and accurate in its description of what was happening with Catholic voters sliding toward Republican as they moved to the suburbs primarily, how they might return, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when Sorensen was done, Kennedy, always thinking politically, bless his heart, thought that if the thing were distributed as the Sorensen report, that it would look like the work of a sycophant on his staff. And so he got a pal in politics, the legendary chairman of the Democratic Party in Connecticut, John Bailey, who loved Kennedy and labored on his behalf all the way through 1960. He got Bailey to agree to have his name put on the document. So it became known as the Bailey Report. And in his oral history, John Bailey, who is a legendary figure many of us just absolutely loved, said, I got all the credit and Ted Sorensen did all the work. It was great. Yes, ma'am.
I seem to remember there was a lot of talk about chicanery in the West Virginia primary. Is that correct? Was there?
Yes. It's West Virginia. Appalachia, sadly, with all its other problems, has also had horrible politics for a century. A lot of money, a fair amount of money went into West Virginia. Some of it was tainted. We found the one piece of evidence of something that may have been mafia-related surfaced with regard to West Virginia and involved about $50,000. But yes, were votes bought? Yes. But we didn't stop with the yes. Because for some reason, I got obsessed with the question, how much did a vote cost in West Virginia in 1960? And I found the perfect source. He sadly died 2 years ago. Great guy named Richard Donahue from Lowell, Massachusetts, who was an original charter member of the Irish Mafia and Ken O'Donnell's right hand and left hand in operational matters throughout the campaign. And shortly before he died, Dick told me, rolled his eyes and said, okay, here's the way I understand it. If you wanted a vote in one of what he called those counties, primarily he meant in the southern part of the state, a vote cost $2 plus a half pint of branded whiskey. If it was moonshine, it was a full pint. So I can tell my grandchildren I figured out how much a vote cost in West Virginia in 1960. Yes, sir. Over there. Is this it?
Final question.
Okay.
Questions. The first question I would like to ask you is concerning the debate that Kennedy got involved with Nixon, the missile gap debate. We know that obviously Eisenhower knew that the notion that the Soviet Union was somehow a great danger was not really the case. You know, they knew at that point in time. Did Kennedy know that talking about the missile gap would put Nixon in an impossible situation? Was he aware of it, or did he thought it was a missile gap?
Not in that way. We came to the conclusion after our research, for what it's worth, that Kennedy's raising of this issue, beginning early, we found the first examples of it from 1957, was genuine. And in fact came out of the work of several people, beginning with the Ford Foundation, actually, that had begun to worry in the early part of the 1950s that the Soviet Union in some ways seemed a more dynamic society than the United States, at least as far as their investment in science, technology, engineering, and weaponry was concerned. Kennedy's view of all this was relatively mainstream. The guy he almost picked as his running mate, Stuart Symington, was perhaps the most significant advocate of the theory, namely that if trends were not stopped, the Soviet Union in advanced, especially heavy rocketry, would achieve parity and more with the United States sometime in the 1960s. That was the issue in a little bit more detail. But Kennedy's view wasn't unusual. There were elements of the Eisenhower administration, actually, that thought, weren't sure, but that he might have a point. And at any rate, it was not until pictures from U-2s and eventually satellites that it was possible to make the case that while there was something to be concerned about in terms of Soviet investment in especially heavy rockets, big rockets, the situation was not dire. Politically, Kennedy probably overstated it. But it was, this was an honest debate, and it's an example of the person Kennedy faced the country as. Not a typical Cold Warrior, but a vigorous anti-communist nonetheless. I'll close with this vulgar remark. His friend, Joe Alsop, the columnist, who was another advocate of the theory of the missile gap, looked at all of Kennedy's positions on foreign policy and decided he had a chance to get elected because he was Adlai Stevenson with balls. Thank you very much.
Just a reminder, folks, there's a book signing one level up at the Archives bookstore. We'll meet you up there in just a couple moments.